every day around all of our elementary, middle schools. We have 30 minutes of traffic that are just drive parents to pull U-turns, honk, kids are dropped off on the wrong side. It's unsafe. There are so many different ways to really try and address this transportation issue thoughtfully, and through this course of the campaign, we're going to have some more specific details that we get into. But overall, gas tax, not good. More resources for local transportation is the solution. The bullet train is that same kind of equation where money continues to pile up and not used to benefit us here.
Thank you, Macker. All right, so we've talked a little bit about transportation. I'm hoping we get into maybe housing, homeless, infrastructure issues as well. One issue that all four of those issues have in common is that they're impacted by the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. A lot of calls for reform, a lot of momentum on that, but the bottom line is that CEQA still prevents significant obstacles to getting stuff done. So let me ask, and we'll start with Jesse, do you support CEQA reform? Why or why not, and what would you do to fix it?
Yeah, I think, look, I'll say this first of all. I think CEQA is really important, and I think it's important that we consider our environment when we're making decisions, and when we're making decisions about building and land use and everything else. At the same time, I do recognize that there has been abuse of CEQA, and that there have been people who've used CEQA not for its intended purposes. And so if there's an opportunity to improve the law to make it better, particularly if we can find ways to have meaningful reform, bring the environmental community into the conversation and think about how do we make sure that we can expedite the construction of housing and of affordable housing in particular, I think that's an important thing to do. So I would be open to having a conversation about how we could improve CEQA. We need to preserve its essence, which is to make sure that we're thinking about the environment when we're making land use and planning and transportation and infrastructure decisions. But at the same time, if we can make the law better and solve our state's housing affordability crisis, that's really important. Our housing crisis is not just about homelessness. It's also about our economy. We lose $140 billion a year in GDP, 6% of our GDP because of our state's housing affordability crisis. So this is a really fundamental and important public policy challenge that we need to solve as a state. And it's important for moral reasons, and it's also important for economic reasons. And so if I'm up in Sacramento, I'm going to be trying to think about what are the different things that we can do to increase our state's supply of housing. We're 49 out of 50 in per capita housing, and address that issue.
So I'm not just open to a conversation, I want to be somebody who leads the conversation. CEQA does need to be reformed on so many levels. My particular experience working for the school district, right, when you're trying to build a school, you're trying to do a project, the process is open to gaming, right? And me being maybe too open and transparent about the knowledge and information I've had, the school district, the way that, it's only 15 seconds, we only got a minute on this.
No. Keep going.
The way that the school district can assign somebody to do the environmental impact report and the way that it can be gamed, there's a lot of nuance there, not just on the environmental aspect, but the way that houses and developments are built, the transportation angle. Again, part of the CEQA process that isn't necessarily gone into as much depth as it needs to. So again, not just a conversation about reforming it, but leading the way, tapping into folks like VICA and everyone else in 45 to make sure that we reform it in a way that's best for our community.
CEQA reform is something that we've been discussing as a state for a while now, at least for the last, I think, 5, 6, 7 years. And there have been various bills that have been presented that have been discussed, and I do think that CEQA reform is something that needs to be done. Now, I understand why it was produced in the first place, and I love the state. It's a beautiful state, and we want to make sure that it always remains a beautiful state. However, I've also seen how it has been abused, particularly by particular attorneys or groups, or even, homeowners associations or other folks who use it because they don't want to have their view blocked, or because they don't feel like there's enough parking in a project that's been put forth. And so, all that being said, it's important to make sure that CEQA is retained, but we need to go ahead and modify it in ways that'll help it work more as it was intended to do so. So things like, the discussion of vehicle miles traveled versus level of service, which has to do with thinking about transportation impacts, how many trips will be generated by the project that you're proposing. Those kinds of common sense things are things that really do need to be modified and looked at. because I'm thinking in particular of the Warner Center 2035 plan, where some of the mitigation measures that were, and I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit technical here, but some of the mitigation measures that were proposed were, 10, 15 miles away from the project area, and they were for road widenings and things like that, and it makes you start to think, is that really necessary? So vehicle miles traveled is much more based on what actually happens, who are the users who are at your business, and it makes, or your building, and it makes much more sense. The other thing that I was thinking about, I just got flashed the 15-second card and it just flew out of my head, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. I wasn't able to grab it again. But in any case, yes, it needs to be reformed so it's not used in ways that it wasn't meant to be.
Okay. Good. All right, still in the 2-minute area. Now, I know that the idea that we can solve or even discuss intelligently the homelessness issue in 2 minutes is a little silly, but let's give it a try. And then just to change things up a little bit, I'm going to reverse the order that people are going in. So let's have Anchor, you go first, and then Jesse, and then Tricia.
Right, so as Tricia mentioned in the last debate, we've been about 100,000 units short year after year for the last 10 years. So building our way out of it is not something that's going to happen quickly. We also mentioned tax breaks for affordable housing. Infill development was something else that Jesse mentioned. So there's a menu of options that we're going to be looking at to address this housing and homelessness issue. One that I'm particularly focused on, and I think it addresses the urgency, right? We have a special election, I have a sense of urgency, I hope you feel it. This position can lead the way in so many different aspects. Safe parking. We have hundreds, if not thousands, people plus living in Assembly District 45 in front of the airport right here, or on Sherman Way, on Conogo Park, in different places. Safe parking is something that can materially benefit hundreds of people's lives in the short term, facilitate a transitional type of program that gets people, families, out of living in the cars or on the streets. Wraparound services, which you all know, look to other places like Utah that have put a housing first program into place, and then bring our resources, our compassion, our intention to bear to solve this problem with a sense of urgency. And I'm sure that other two candidates are going to have some good points to add to that.
Jesse?
Yeah, I appreciate it, Ankur, that you've come around to my point of view on this. A couple of things. The homelessness issue it's an incredible public policy challenge. It's an incredible moral issue. It's an incredible economic issue for this community. A couple of things that we can do. First, the county and the city have taken action with Measure H and Proposition HHH. We need to make sure that as much of that money is coming to the Valley as quickly as possible. Second thing we can do, like Ankur said, look to other jurisdictions that have solved this issue or made progress on it. The Housing First model works, getting people into housing with wraparound permanent supportive services. So if they're struggling with addiction or mental illness or other issues, a lot of that is supporting the good work of people like Stephanie and LA Family Housing, who are trying to do that work and get folks off the streets and keep them off the streets. Increasing our supply of affordable housing. This is a challenge that's actually going to become even harder because our primary means to finance affordable housing is a federal tax credit called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. The economics of that tax credit have changed because of the Trump administration's tax reform plan. So we need to think about how the state can step in and incent more development of affordable housing. And finally, it's just increasing our state's housing supply. We have a fundamental supply-demand imbalance for housing in this state. As I mentioned before, we're 49 out of 50 in per capita housing. And so we need to think about how do we do everything we can to expedite the construction of more housing, which will increase the supply, bring down the cost, and we can have more people in the housing that they deserve.
So I might start this part with thank you, Jesse and Ankur, for coming around to my position. There are several things here. I mean, first off, we just had the homeless count. Last year it was 47,000 people who were homeless. This year it's 58,000. That's almost a 20% increase. It's all over the area. It's all over the state. I went up and down the state last year as part of a program, Emerge California, and saw homelessness as bad in every major city in the state. So it's something that we need to address overall. So some of it is about, as has been mentioned, some of it is about increasing production overall. We've been in a deficit for a very long time. And what it really comes down to is putting more housing in places that make sense. So one of the things that has been discussed is accessory dwelling units. And this is something that had, at the state level, there were very good requirements that were put in place, and we've been thinking about that as a city. And while Scott Wiener's bill talks about producing more housing all along the transit lines in addition to the transit stations, I definitely think it makes sense to have more housing along the transit stations and along major commercial corridors. But I think one of the ways that we can really address it, at least here in the San Fernando Valley, given that so much of our land is single family, is those who wish to put in accessory dwelling units. Because then you have 2 units and it would automatically double capacity in those areas for the folks who are willing to do it. Wraparound services are very important. I think Councilmember Wesson's motion recently that was passed to ensure that we have an equal amount of housing for homeless that gets put in each one of the districts is equally important, because I'm thinking of one person in particular in Eagle Rock when I used to represent that area, and he was chronically homeless, and we kept trying to help him with services, and he grew up in that area, and that's why he was there, and that's why it makes sense to have homeless housing in every one of the council districts. Thank you.
Okay, at the risk of incurring the wrath of Stuart, I'm going to change the rules a little bit. Next 2 questions are going to be what I call lightning round questions. I want to give you 15 seconds each to answer each of these questions, and you'll see when I ask them. They're totally appropriate for 15 seconds. We'll start with Jesse on this one. What's the first bill you plan to introduce if elected?
I would want to introduce a bill to extend our state's film tax credit. I think that's a really important bill for the Valley. It's going to expire soon. It creates a lot of jobs